All right, so let's go through the Silence of the Frogs assignment that's in Google Classroom. If I do get interrupted, I might break the lesson into two parts. So if you notice it suddenly stops, I'll pick up where I left off. So with this one, if we go back over to the instructions, and this is actually for our second week of work, but I thought I would do the videos sooner so that they're done. So this week you should be working on the species at risk presentation. Next week you could probably do both of these assignments. So we'll see how long that takes us. And good job, I've already got one of the species at risk presentations handed in. So that's fantastic. I'm glad to see you guys are getting the work the way that you used to and that you're plugging away from home. Don't forget, I put my contact information up here. If you're struggling, let me know. So let's have a look at Silence of the Frogs. So with the Silence of the Frogs, you guys are going to get a bunch of terminology that relates to the biology unit that we haven't had a chance to go over yet, but it's kind of introduced in a really nice way. So what the article does is it looks at sort of what's happening with frogs and the numbers and sort of the decrease in the amount of frogs that are living in an ecosystem. So what is an ecosystem? This is a term that we would be introduced to in the classroom. So it's used to describe the relationship among many species living in an environment and the relationships among these organisms and the non-living components of the environment. So basically, it's all the living parts of an environment and how they're interacting with the non-living parts of the environment. So, for example, in this article, it would be sort of the frogs and then the other things that are the other animals that are present. And we'll look at those in the food chains down below, but then how they're also interacting with sort of the water, the temperature, the soil pH, all of those sorts of things. So that's what we're looking at here. I did want to actually back up a little bit because I forgot to mention for this one, because I'm on a Chromebook, I'm automatically signed into my Board Apps account. But if you guys are on your computers at home, you may wish to sign in. So usually you use the three little dots and you can sign into your account. If you sign into our board one, so our whatever your code is at apps.hpedsb.on.ca, then you can get your read and write toolbar. So your read and write toolbar is going to work pretty well for this assignment. Oh, mine's dropping down below. No, there it goes. Because you might want to listen to it. It is kind of a longer reading. You may want to highlight and play it. And also some of the highlighting functions that we're going to use later might be easier using this toolbar. So if you don't have the toolbar in the app up above, it means you're not signed into Chrome. So get yourself signed in to your account using this information, whatever your code is at apps.hpedsb.on.ca and your code, and it should work fine for you. Okay, so moving on, now that we've got our read and write, so what are we looking at? So why are scientists concerned? You're going to read a little bit about why they're concerned about decreases in frog populations. And then there's other terms that relate to biology and our unit that you guys would have been exposed to in different grade levels. I'm trying to think of which one you do this, but I don't know off the top of my head. But most people are pretty confident with a food chain, so a step-by-step sequence linking organisms that feed on each other, starting from a food source. So anything that's like a plant would be a producer. So it's called a producer because it's able to produce its own energy from the sun. So basically a plant almost feeds off the sun, where a consumer is something that has to eat something else in order to obtain the energy that it needs to survive. So consumers can eat either plants or they can eat each other. So these are terms that you guys need to become familiar with in this unit. So other terms that you need to become familiar with are herbivores. So what's a herbivore? A herbivore is something that eats a plant. A carnivore is something that eats an animal. And then we've got omnivores, eat both. So they eat plants and animals. So all of those things are terms for our biology unit that are important for you to know. So if frogs were completely wiped out, what's going to happen? It will talk about that. When we talk about food chains, you've got two examples here. So in the first food chain, you've got grasses, you've got a grasshopper, frogs, and a heron. So basically, our producer is the grass because it's producing its energy from the sun, directly from the sun. And then we've got our grasshopper, our frogs, and our heron that are all consumers. But if we think specifically, even though they're all consumers, one of them is a herbivore and the other two are carnivores. So we need to know what those terms mean. So our grasshopper is eating a plant, therefore it's a herbivore. Our frog is eating only a grasshopper, which means in this example, so that means that it's a carnivore and another carnivore because it's eating another animal. If the frog had an arrow going to the grasses, so it was eating the grasshopper and the grass, then it would be considered an omnivore. So let's look at this one here. This is our second food chain. So we'll notice a frog can either be in this position in the food chain or it could be up here as a tadpole. So in this food chain, we've got dead algae, we've got a tadpole, we've got a water boatman, and we've got a yellow perch. So our producer, so it's producing, it's able to grab its energy from the sun to produce its own food. So that would be algae. Tadpoles have to consume something else. So a tadpole is a consumer because it eats the algae, but it is also a herbivore because it's eating plants. In this case, the water boatman is eating the tadpole, which means that it is a carnivore because it's eating another organism. Same thing with the perch. It's eating another organism. So what are a couple of other terms that we need to know in this unit? So decomposers. What are decomposers? They're organisms that break down and get their nutrient basically from almost like dead things. So they break down sort of dead animal remains as well as the waste from plants and animals. And they're able to break that down and use that for sort of their energy source. So that's another example of a term that we need to know in this unit. So the article then goes on and talks about why frogs are disappearing. And you look at this graph here, we've got a changing population of amphibians. So in 1984, there were this many amphibians and there were 500-ish frogs. When we look at 1985, we see the total amphibians and a huge chunk of them are the frogs. But then what happens in 1986? We've got a pretty major drop in a 2-year span where it goes from 700, 800 amphibians all the way down to about 50, 60 amphibians. And we've got a major drop in our frogs as they go from 500 and maybe 530 down all the way until maybe 30 or so if I was to do an estimate. So then what's happening here? The article gives you a few different examples. So it talks about the fact that there's a loss of habitat, and then it goes through and explains, and actually this is another term that you need to know. So habitat is just where a species lives. So if we start to destroy habitat, then what's going to happen? They're not going to have as much of an area to live, so their population is going to decrease. What else do we have? Things like air and water quality. So as the air quality gets more poor, as the water quality gets more poor, then that's obviously going to impact the frog. And this part sort of outlines examples or evidence for that. UV radiation. So ultraviolet radiation, which comes from the sun. So what's happening? We're seeing damage to the ozone layer. And then what happens is there's more UV rays that reach the Earth's surface. And then those UV rays are going to impact the species because all of a sudden they're exposed to a higher level of these rays that they wouldn't have been, which are going to be harmful to their skin as well. It talks about the impacts on their eggs and that sort of things. So basically, you've got your headings with the things that are impacting the frogs, and then some really good examples of how they're being impacted here. So the final example that it gives is climate change. So with climate change, what's happening basically with global warming? What do we see? Increased use of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas, and then it's going to cause changes to our ecosystem. So if we change the ecosystem, which is the area that the frogs live and all the parts of the area that they live with, that they interact with, whether they're living or non-living, then that's going to impact the frog too. So, sorry, excuse me. Let's have a look at our questions. So with these questions, I would like you to do full sentence answers. And you have the time. I'm not overwhelming you with work. So take the time and make sure that you do your full sentence answers. So the first one, explain the difference between the two food chains to which the frog belongs. Explain the role of the frog in each chain. So you're going to go back up. Where was the part where we talked about the frog and its different roles? So in the first food chain, you could specifically say that there were the grasses, the grasshopper, the frog, and then the heron. So in this food chain, the frog is eating the grasshopper, which makes it what? A carnivore, right? It's feeding on another animal. In the other food chain, and you could specifically list it, so where it's got dead algae, tadpole, water boatman, and yellow perch, what's happening? The tadpole is feeding on the algae. What is it called when an organism feeds on a plant? So I'm not going to answer it, but it's pretty close to there. You need to identify that term. So down here, you are going to give me the examples of the two chains, and then you're going to tell me the difference between the two food chains in terms of the frog. So the frog is behaving as one thing in one food chain, and it's behaving as another in the other food chain. But I want you to list all parts of the food chains here. Okay. So number 2, according to scientists, what are some probable causes? So 5 of them behind the disappearance of the frogs. So again, you're going to give me a full sentence answer. So there are many, I'll fix that capital later, probable causes for the disappearance of the frog. So we're just restating the question here in our answer. So there are many probable causes for the disappearance of the frog. And let's go back up. The first is loss of habitat. So people are destroying the places where frogs live. You could pull out some example. For example, they need wetlands, ponds, or lakes with clean water so they can breed and lay their eggs. And as we build up cities, we're starting to destroy some of those areas. So you could give me that example there. Another example would be, because you need 5 of them, so loss of habitat would be 1, air and water quality, and give me an example of how that's impacting them. UV radiation, give me an example of how that's impacting the frog, and then finally climate change, and give me an example. So you should have the 5 causes, but also how it's impacting the frog. Okay. So number 3 is a little bit trickier. So number 3, explain why the life cycle and the skin of the frog make a good bioindicator of the health of an ecosystem. So if we go back up to the article, we can find where it says this term bioindicator. So the frog is not the only animal whose skin is exposed to UV. Humans also have delicate skin and are also affected by increase in UV rays. The fact that the rate of human skin cancer is rising all over the world underscores the importance of studying frogs as a bioindicator of the health of a planet. So I don't think it actually defines it anywhere. So let's look up quickly what a bioindicator is. Yeah, okay. So a bioindicator is any species, an indicator species, or a group of species whose function, population, or status can reveal the qualitative status of an environment. So that's a lot of big words. But basically what it means is if you look at the frog as a species, it can help you to understand how healthy the environment is. So there was a part back up here that does a really good job of explaining this as well. And it's sort of around this area. So why scientists are concerned. So it talks about the fact that frogs can basically live in they have 2 different life cycles. So if you think about down in your food chains, you can see that frogs obviously have these 2 different life cycles. One is where they're living in the water. The other is where they're up and living on the land. So if frogs are being impacted in the water, then you could think about, well, how does that relate to the health of the water? So how would a decrease in the number of tadpoles be a bioindicator of sort of the health of the pond in that area? And then you could think about, well, what about the frogs that are living on the land? If we had a huge decrease of the frogs that are living sort of around the water, then why is that happening? And what does that mean for the environment? So that's how you're going to kind of relate this bioindicator. So if you see the number of tadpoles decrease in a pond area, then maybe there's something going wrong with the pond itself. Maybe there's some sort of drainage from an industrial plant that's polluting the water. So you could say that the lack of the number of tadpoles would be an indicator that that area isn't very healthy. So that's how you're going to sort of answer this question. And there's a lot of room for sort of your own personal ideas there, whereas some of the other questions are more cut and dry. Okay, so finally, make a list of things so 3 of them that humans could do that might help frogs to survive. So what are 3 things that we could do? Go back up and think about these things, and you're going to find ideas there. So what are 3 things that we could do? And then which ones would be easy for us and which ones would be difficult? So of the 3, say you gave an example of one, or let's put humans could destroy less of the frogs' habitat. Would that be easy or hard for us? Well, it could be. It could be really hard for us because maybe we're talking about habitat that surrounds the GTA or the Greater Toronto area. And then what happens? Well, we've got so many people that are trying to live in that area that would be a hard thing for us to accomplish. Oh, and here comes Izzy and Anna. So again, which ones would be easy for us and which ones would be difficult for us? So that's what you need to come up with. Full sentence answers. Okay, so this should help give you a really good start with this article. Take your time, and this is what I'm expecting of you next week. But I thought since some people are done, I would post the how-to video.